The coronavirus pandemic has prompted more attention to the effect of climate change on health, but there has also been a retreat on one environmental measure familiar to shoppers at supermarkets as a result of the governor's emergency ban on reusable bags. According to environmental advocates at MASSPIRG, there should be a way to avoid single-use plastic bags while still protecting customers and employees. To explain is the executive director at MASSPIRG and the MASSPIRG Education Fund, Janet Domenitz. Thank you very much for being with us, Janet.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Janet, let's go back before the pandemic to the earlier move to get rid of all those plastic bags where we've gotten used to using reusable bags in most cases, but why was plastic so bad in the first place?
How much time you got? I think the move to reduce single-use plastics, mainly around bags, but many other items, really does include a long laundry list of problems. And I will start with number one. We use the term throw away, but nothing ever goes away. And plastic in particular stays in the environment for seems like hundreds, we don't know yet how long because it hasn't really been around for more than 60 or 70 years. But what we do know is we find them in the oceans, we find them in our rivers, we find them hanging from trees, they clog up drains, they stay where they end up. And the vast majority of them end up in places that harm the environment. So that's number one. Number two, they're made of, fossil fuels. I mean, you need petroleum to make that kind of plastic, flexible plastic. And so the materials that go into manufacturing a plastic bag are themselves detrimental to the environment. I think they also represent, as I said earlier, it's not just bags, but it's this whole notion that things are disposable. We're trying to make disposable a dirty word again, because over the past couple of decades, the explosion of single-use and disposable items have harmed our environment, have hurt our public health. As I said earlier, are made of things that we're trying to get rid of. And we just need to get back to the future and start eliminating those kinds of things and use much more sustainable items.
Well, as opposed to either the future or the past, a lot of us are living in the present right now. And so when we go to the supermarket, we're told, don't bring your reusable bags because if you have germs in your house, you're going to infect people at the supermarket, or your bags could come into an area that has been infected by somebody else's bags. I mean, isn't there a problem with using reusable bags?
Yeah. So let me say two different things about that. Well, actually, I'm going to say three, if you'll bear with me, in no particular order. Number one, if you go back to the end of March, which I know seems like 20 years ago at this point, the move to freeze the use of reusables and to lift the bans on plastic bags that were already in place in something like 140 cities and towns in Massachusetts, I believe was largely a result of lobbying by the plastics industry. You did not see a movement from public health officials. You did not see studies coming out from the medical schools. What you saw was a swift and huge effort by the plastics industry to start putting the fear of germs and reusable bags as like these monsters carrying virus on them. And in fact, at the end of March, a New York Times reporter did an extensive piece showing that the plastics industry immediately went to the federal government and said, now's the time to get back to using plastic bags because they're safer. And it was based on zero science or research. So that's number one, that the move to do this really seems as far as I can tell, to have been generated from the industry that wants us to use the plastic bags. Number two, again, in the immediate crisis back in March, in the first few weeks where, we were trying to figure out what was going on, I understood, let's pause everything. It was almost like stop breathing, until we know what's going on here. Now, in the last several weeks, the connections have started to be made between the way that we treat the planet and the spread of these viruses around the planet, like it's seemingly in 2 seconds flat. And that if we're going to think about how we protect our public health in the future and how we preserve the environment, we're going to need to really look at where those things intersect. And so this isn't just about reusable bags. This is about living our lives in a way that appreciates what sustainability really means. And in fact, burning down forests in Brazil results in viruses traveling around the globe more quickly. So we need to make the connections between how we live our everyday lives and how that serves or inhibits protecting our public health and preserving the environment. So that's number two. And then number three, I happen to be the person who does the supermarket shopping in this household, where there's been 4 of us since the middle of March. And as infrequent as I have tried to make my trips, I've been to a number of different markets a number of times since the middle of March. And what I realized is, even after the grocery stores started putting up those shields between customer and cashier, forget about the environment, forget about sustainability. You're spending more time in the store if you're waiting for the cashier to scan all those items and then go to the end of the conveyor belt and bag all your items into paper or plastic bags. A, you're spending more time in the store. B, at that part of the interaction, there is no plexiglass. So it would actually be much safer for both the cashier and me if, while the cashier is scanning the items, I'm standing at the end of the conveyor belt, putting the items into my bag. It really shortens the time that I'm in the store, our exposure to each other. And of course, the cashier never has to touch my bag. So forget about the environmental considerations. As I'm not an industrial engineer, but it seems to me to make complete common sense to limit the amount of time that I'm in the store and limit my interaction with the cashier. So for all those reasons and many more, it would make so much sense to get back to using reusable bags and to reinstating the plastic bag bans that, as I said, existed in 140 or so cities and towns in Massachusetts.
I do a lot of bagging myself, and at least the way I usually did it was I had a reusable bag. I had it at the end of the belt there, behind the cashier. And so my bag was coming into contact with things in the store. It was a surface. Now, I mean, this is how I think about it nowadays.
Sure.
But how do you prevent that from happening in the future if people are going to use reusable bags?
So it's funny, I had this conversation. I live a couple of blocks from Trader Joe's, and I had this conversation. It's like the most low-tech solution. So at the end of the conveyor belt, they have these hooks where bags hang. And it had been a place for where they sold their reusable bags. And I was like, just take those away. Let me hang my reusable bag on this little hook. And so I'm not touching the surface, that you're using. And I mean, how much effort, I wouldn't even honestly worry myself, but how much effort would it take once a customer leaves to just spray that one little hook and wipe it off, and then the next customer comes through? I mean, that literally would take 3 seconds. So I think there are very low-tech, common sense solutions to the concern which, as I say, I'm still looking for the science that backs up the idea that if I sit my reusable bag on the surface at the end of that conveyor belt, that somehow that transmits this disease. I don't believe it. If someone has the science that shows that's a real threat, I'd love to read it. But in the meantime, for the sake of over caution, you can still eliminate that contact. And of course, if someone can't bag themselves, then sure, let the cashier put it in the paper bag or the plastic bag. But that's a fraction of people shopping. And I should know, because I've actually been taking advantage of senior hour, and I see people going in, and they all seem able to me.
Yeah, I want to ask about one other issue that is related to plastics, and that is the redemption of bottles. That has also, I guess, been on hold. I know there were health concerns that were invoked for that as well. What about the practicality of being able to resume that?
So on Friday, late Friday, 3 or 4 days ago, the governor announced that redemption will resume. This Friday, June 5th, redemption resumes at places that have the reverse vending machines. And then I believe it's 2 weeks later, on June 19th, redemption resumes in store, where you do the returns, with a person behind the counter. So they're phasing it in, but they announced on Friday that redemption will resume in Massachusetts, which again, if we're going to think about, we've really taken a step backwards. And I understand the first several weeks, we really had to be extremely conservative and cautious about a lot of things that we do in our everyday lives. But now that the governor, we're in phase 1, we're likely to get to phase 2. So the governor seems to think it's time to start getting back to certain parts of our everyday lives. This has to be job number 1, to get back to being a state that's committed to reducing waste, that is committed to sustainability, that is thinking about how we protect and preserve our public health and our environment.